For someone whose entire career has been focused on joy, why a podcast on pain? Because these stories need to be told. A good phoenix rising out of the ashes story reminds us all that not only can we survive, we can thrive. And when we emerge, we're different. That's the alchemy of pain. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Alchemy of Pain podcast. I'm Brenda Viola, and as you know, I have the privilege of interviewing people who have been through painful situations. And the pain did not break them. It didn't make them bitter. It made them better. We do this because we want to provide content that offers hope. Maybe you might be in a situation similar or know someone who is going through a very difficult time. Learning from other people who have found meaning in the process or had their aha moment might help you have your own. And so I'm really very honored to have a brand new friend of mine on the podcast today. And there are three words that characterize his journey: misunderstood, misdiagnosed, and mistreated. My friend is David Wetherelt, and he is a speaker and an advocate. And I first want to jump off of those words: misunderstood, misdiagnosed, mistreated. What do those words mean to you, David?
Well, it goes back my entire life. I know your podcast is about some specific pain, but I've actually had pain that I didn't know was a painful situation for me for my entire life. And misunderstood. I was misunderstood by myself. I was misunderstood by my family, my teachers, and then into my adulthood, my healthcare providers, my coworkers. I've always been kind of successful, but there was always something that felt like was missing. Always felt different. And, later in life, it showed up as anxiety and depression and, trying to figure out my substance use and things like alcohol, using alcohol. And it was a lot of confusion, right? And I don't want to point fingers at the healthcare profession. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the misunderstood part is probably the key to all of this. And that misunderstanding actually leads to misdiagnosis. And when it comes to my particular pain was, it was finding out I was neurodiverse, more specifically that I found out that I was autistic. And this was, when I was in my 58th year. And I've been,
Okay, wow. 58 years of thinking something's wrong with you. Maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with me, and nobody diagnosed it for 58 years. I have to say, maybe it was a relief to find out, but also, oh my gosh, I'm neurodiverse.
Yeah, it was interesting, Brenda. I'll never forget this moment when I found out myself before I even got the official diagnosis. I was visiting my son who lives in Hawaii, and I had been on this journey for the past year where I was reading all the studies coming out of Stanford about neurobiology and neuroscience and Robert Sapolsky's books and everybody that had Gabor Mate and The Myth of Normal and all these wonderful authors, and reading all the studies. And I was really fascinated, and Daniel Amen and his books, but I was fascinated about the way the brain works because for years and years and years, and especially starting in the early 2000s, I really started struggling. I ended up having these episodes and meltdowns, and I ended up hospitalized over the years. And I couldn't quite figure it out. I had therapists, I had psychiatrists, I had psychiatric medications, I had all these things. And I go over to Hawaii, and this was 8 months ago. And I read all of these things. And my son is very smart. He's in the Navy, he's stationed over in Hawaii. And we were driving down the road one day in Hawaii, and I was explaining to him what I learned about amygdala hijack and the prefrontal cortex and all the processes. And I said, I figured out that I had this overactive amygdala situation. And I was describing all the prefrontal cortex and how that worked and all the brain chemistry and everything. And I said, and I think that's why because he's seen me drink too much and struggle with that. And I said, I think that's why I was drinking too much. And he said, oh, just like the gal in the movie series on Netflix called The Queen's Gambit. And I said, yo, no, but she was autistic. And I went, wait a minute. Literally, in that moment I went, and I never once dawned on me in my entire life, because I always thought of autism as that 9 or 10-year-old little boy that was nonverbal or, acting funny or, that kind of thing. Or I had the vision of Rain Man as autism in my head. Never once had it never even dawned on me until that moment. And then I got on the plane and I actually downloaded one other thing by Robert Sapolsky and started reading that. And by the time that I landed back in San Diego, I had convinced myself, and I knew, it was just like, I knew right then. And I got off the plane and I went down to baggage claim, and I felt like Dorothy kind of walking behind the door in The Wizard of Oz where everything was in color. I went, no wonder. And then within about 2 weeks of that, I contacted somebody that could do an official screening for me. Had a wonderful conversation with this gentleman. We went through the screening process, and then we had a lot of conversations, and we both decided that one of my sons, Matthias, who had been diagnosed with ADHD, he gets screened as well. But getting the official diagnosis was profound as well. But it was that moment of that realization. And since I've been on this journey, I read all kinds of articles online about people getting late diagnosis with autism, ADHD, OCD, these types of things. And they're all, just so we're all aware, they're all related. It's on this spectrum, and it's all these little levers and things like that. And intensity, it's not like a linear line. If you look at the autism spectrum quotient, there's like a wheel, and you have different capabilities and things like that. But yeah, it was finding out that, figuring out for myself with my son, but then getting the official diagnosis. It was, the self-acceptance was profound because it explained so much. And since then, I worked with a therapist for about a year and a half. And when I found out, I contacted her again, and I said, oh, let's go have a cup of tea in your office or whatever. And I sat her down, and she was a wonderful lady. And we worked for a whole year, and we worked through issues. And it was like, well, maybe you're borderline personality disorder. Maybe you're bipolar. Maybe you've got ADHD or things like that. Never once did anybody ever mention autism. And I sat down with her and finally told her what I learned. And I gave her some of the books that I got since then. And she had a little bit of a cry. And, and she felt bad. I'm like, there's no reason to feel bad, because one of the things with a lot of times with Asperger's, they used to call it Asperger's. I have ASD level 1 without intellectual disability. But what happens is, and when I was a child, they didn't even have the word autism, right? That word came up in the 80s, and Asperger's came in the 80s. But, when I was a child, they called it childhood schizoid disorder, if anything. Nobody got tested in the 60s and 70s. But, she actually said to me, she said, based on you and the way that you presented, she said, I could go back and look at my entire patient panel. And she said, probably 60-70% of my people are probably on the spectrum. And she said, I suspected a lot of them were, but she said, I never saw the connection to the other manifestations of these mental health issues or these addiction issues as being part of it. It was always, well, you've got addiction issues, but you've also got ADHD, and they're very much intricately entwined. And there's something that I would do, that a lot of us do, and it's called masking, right? And it's a very simple thing where it's basically, because I'm growing up confused about my information processing differences, I end up kind of pretending, right? So I'm trying to pretend to be like the other kids. I'm trying to pretend to, make eye contact. I'm trying, and I'm getting sensory overwhelm, and I'm trying to act normal, or what I think normal might be. So there's always this extra step with somebody that has some spectrum issues. If they don't know they have spectrum issues, there's an extra step in there where you've got an extra layer of, mental gyrations going on. in order
And
to
that takes a
present
lot
yourself.
of energy. That takes
It-
a lot of energy in your life. I think there might be a lot of people listening right now and their minds are a little bit blown because
yeah,
almost everybody knows someone with alcohol or drug addictions
or
or
mental illness.
mental illness.
Yeah,
We can also wrap in the homeless situation and so many of the members of that population.
yeah,
And yet, what was interesting when you and I met, you said, it's easier to confess to being an alcoholic or more socially acceptable
yep,
than it is to own up to this stigma of being on the spectrum,
yes, yes.
which we need to remove that stigma because otherwise we're just doing band-aid solutions and not addressing the underlying issue,
Yeah,
which was
it's
your aha moment.
yeah, you're giving me goosebumps because yes, I couldn't agree with you more, and I think that the stigma is still such a challenge. The strange part is you can have somebody like Elon Musk go on Saturday Night Live and say, "Yes, I'm autistic." You can have we can clearly throughout history you've got people that were autistic, Thomas Edison, Tesla. You've got you've got the ones that are kind of the cool neurodiverse, right? The ones that are the scientists. And if you look at the evolutionary traits of this, if you read Simon Baron-Cohen from Cambridge University, he's got a wonderful book called The Pattern Seekers, and that's where I actually came up with the name of my organization, Homo Systemus. So in the Pattern Seekers, he actually outlays some of the mechanics of the evolutionary process, how we ended up with neurodiversity, but all the positive traits about it as well. And it's if you've got with neurodiversity, typically you've got more connections going on, you've got more information coming in, but you can get overwhelmed by it. But if somehow you can figure out how to find your focus, you can end up being very successful. You can be lawyers, doctors, dentists, CEOs. You can be running Amazon or Facebook or and a large part of my career, it's interesting. I look back at my days in Silicon Valley. I was in Silicon Valley for many, many years. And I look back and I've actually reached out to some of my friends from the past in that business. And there's a huge amount of neurodiversity in Silicon Valley because this is where a lot of the innovation comes from. That systemizing or that way of thinking, if you can channel that energy, it can be a good thing. But then, the downside of this as well is with all this extra connections and sensory, overload, there can be bad things that come with that as well. Anxiety, depression, misunderstanding. And this is where the misdiagnosis and the mistreatment comes in, right? So if you don't understand that you have this kind of difference and can appreciate it, and it is genetic. So if it's in your family, if I used to say, oh, my dad was a certain way or my mom was a certain way. But I've gotten together with my sisters and we've actually gone through the family now and really had a hard look at what the symptoms look like. My sister was a nurse for 35 years and very smart and everything. And she's like, I can't believe I missed it. Within her own family, she had her son had dyslexia and he had learning disability and all of these things. But he actually got and figured out a way to focus this. And now he's an executive at a major clothing company. So the point is, it's this thing that gets misdiagnosed, misunderstood, but some people thrive, in spite of it, and that actually thrive because of it. I look at my career and mine started taking a dark turn in the last decade or whatever. But really, I mean, I've traveled all over the world. I've worked for, some of the largest corporations in America, really kind of smart. I do a lot of writing. And I look back, and if I had been, my real challenges started in 2008, and I ended up hospitalized. And not one time did anybody mention anything about this. Since then, I've run into many, many people because I do a lot of talks and I go and talk in circles of people, especially around addiction. And I meet weekly, I meet people of my age and they say, I wish I would have been diagnosed earlier. Or
Mhm.
they're clearly thinking that they are this after I tell my story. And and for your listeners, I think how you open up that this thread of discussion for your listeners out there, I meet people and I tell my story and they go and they identify with it. And I remember the look on their face. They're like, huh. And I could see the wheels turning, going, maybe I have some of this. And these are perfectly successful people. But there's a piece sometimes with people. There's like something's different in my wiring, or I feel different. Or, like with me, the examples that I always use, because I found out that systemizing or minimizing change in my routine and things like that is actually comforting. And I didn't even realize that I would do it. So I go to yoga every day, and I've got a parking spot at my yoga. Nobody knows it's my parking spot, and if somebody parks in my parking spot, I get all nervous, and I never realized that. Now I know that it's because I have these neuro differences, and that sameness and that routine and that lack of uncertainty is comforting to me.
So I want to jump in here
Yeah.
because when you don't know what it is and you get anxious over a parking spot, the tendency is to beat yourself up and say, "What the heck is wrong with me? Why would a stupid parking space mess me up?" And now you're able to accept that it is a component of this
Yes.
condition. You know, and similarly with alcohol, I mean, you were trying to manage your life with all this information overload. So
Yes.
numbing yourself perhaps helped, but not in a healthy way. But now you can do things that are healthy that help you manage, like your very cool glasses.
Oh yeah, these. Yeah, in fact, I wear these quite a bit. You'll see me, and I think the last time when I saw you out, I had pink ones on. But one of the things that they found out is there's this condition that's called Irlen syndrome that aligns quite a bit with autism, with ADHD, with dyslexia, dyscalculia, which is trouble with math. And a lot of it is it's not that you don't understand what you're reading, it's the light processing. And a lot of it comes from artificial light and fluorescent lights and LED lights. So I wear blue blockers all the time, or these colored filter glasses. And I'll give you an example of one guy that I race sailboats, and there's one of the greatest boat mechanics in San Diego, a dear friend of mine. And, and I started talking to him about this, and he's like, oh yeah, I think, I might be on the spectrum. The doctors always said maybe I was on the spectrum and all this. He's a little bit younger. And I told him about Erlen, and because he was going to take his boat captain's license, which is this, a lot of studying, a lot of details. And he's like, I can't comprehend anything when I read, and I have a very difficult time. And so I actually went to his house, and he lives behind a surf shop, and because he does shaping on surfboards, and it's all fluorescent lights. And I said, dude, I said, first of all, this artificial lighting, you got to put some filters over this. But I went and got him a book on Irlen syndrome. I got him colored filters, and I got him some colored glasses. About 3 months later, I saw him again. He had prescription glasses with the colored ones in them. This is going to sound dramatic, but he was literally standing up straighter, and he came and he grabbed me and he says, I aced my captain's test. He says, I studied, I changed my lighting, I did everything else, and it changed everything dramatically. And then even prior to the Erlen discussion, I had discussions with him about, one of the things I've also found out is if you're on the spectrum at all, and goes from, OCD, ADHD, autism, to more severe things like schizophrenia. But if you're anywhere on that spectrum, you process information a little bit differently. And you tend to find people that you like, and a lot of times people that you fall in love with, and you might be different people, but you have different aspects of this thing. And I really like this guy, and it turns out that that's a thing where you end up liking people that might have some, neuro kind of information processing differences, such as yourself. There's kind of like a tribe thing. You don't even know why you like them. There's people that I've met that I normally wouldn't associate with or have nothing in common with, but it's like, I just like you, right? And it's that processing information. Now, when we start talking about this too, and I don't want to get too much into the statistics, but and again, ADHD, autism, it's all linked. There's no overlap. In fact, most of the terminology when you talk about autism, like meltdowns and burnouts that I'll talk to a little bit, they also have ADHD meltdowns and burnouts. And so there's so much similarities, right? So this gentleman, I'm not going to diagnose. He hasn't been diagnosed with autism. He's been diagnosed with ADHD. To me, it's all part of the same thing, right? It's just levels of severity and things like that, which is, you'll hear people get, freaked out if they've got ADHD. And I said, well, you kind of have these same things, and you can look at it the same way. And I don't want to talk about that because of that stigma around autism. And autism it's just a naming convention that was put together. And there's like with the DSM categorizations, there's literally committees where they vote on these things, right? So it's people voting on names and where the cutoffs are and things like that. So I try not to get too caught up in the names about that. But I was going to make a point with you and I forgot.
Well, I do want to go back to the healthy ways to manage this. One is
Oh,
the light, and the other thing is diet that you mentioned to me.
oh boy, oh boy. So, that was when I started, started writing about this and started putting together Homo systemus and the idea of screening people, because I thought, with the homeless populations, and by the way, England especially and Britain, Great Britain, they're doing so much with this. They do more of the studies, they do more of the research, they've got more of the diagnosed population, and more of the understanding of the links to addiction and to mental health and how that affects it. But one of the things that I started studying with all of this is, when I put this together, I had a lot of people, because I was in the healthcare data analytics business, and everybody says, okay, so let's say you go out and, your thing is, 70, 80% of the homeless population is on the spectrum. Um, what do you do with them then, right? If you're going to diagnose them, you're going to get them to say, oh, you've got ADHD. Is it just, throwing, Adderall at them, if they've got ADHD? What do you do? Is it talk therapy or whatever? And so I even started diving deeper on this. And one of the things that led me down was I started looking at nutrition, and even me and my son, because we got diagnosed, I started looking at how can I help him better and help me better. Mostly I was worried about my son. And I thought we ate healthy, right? But there's some wonderful books that I could recommend. In fact, on my website, I'm going to start putting up some recommendations. There's one that's called Ultra Processed People. There's one that's called The End of Mental Illness by Daniel Amen, Dr. Daniel Amen. And another one, Metabolical, and I forget the author of Metabolical, but they all say the same things about our current food system, the way that we eat, the way that we process foods. And boy, oh boy, when I found out that, I went down that, started studying that. I've changed my life. I had the diagnosis, 6 months ago. And about 3 months ago, I changed my diet, and it is dramatic. And my son changed his diet as well. My son, it's been 3 months for him. He was always a kind of an artist and loner, not very good social skills. And we had this thing where we would drink Diet Monster energy drinks and eat ramen noodles. Turns out those are the two worst things that you could eat, just absolute worst things. Because one of the things that I did learn about the brain and all of this is, with people that are on the spectrum, or people even that have addiction problems, typically they have some sort of imbalance between something called glutamate, which is the most, the highest prevalent neurotransmitter in the brain. Nobody talks about it. Everybody talks about dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, but glutamate is where the brain kind of gets its energy, and it's an excitatory neurotransmitter. GABA, that's the neurotransmitter. That's the regulator for us, right? That's the one that gives us the ah. So if you drink alcohol or you take benzodiazepines or Ativan or Xanax, that's the one that brings your GABA up. And a lot of times, if you've got somebody with neurodiversity, they have social anxiety because they've got too much of this excitatory neurotransmitter called glutamate. And if you eat things like monosodium glutamate, which is a free-form glutamate, you're just mainlining anxiety right into your brain. And the other thing that, increases glutamate is, things that I changed my diet completely. Aspartame and all the diet, the diets, those are so terrible because they really screw up the process because glutamate actually gets converted to GABA. So you want to be able to convert that to GABA, not have too much glutamate. Drinking alcohol will help, but you'll still have more glutamate. So you want to increase that process. And anything with gluten in it, this is why a lot of people get better on gluten-free diets, because of the way that we process our wheat. our wheat is actually processed and our flour is a little bit different than the flour that you'll get in Italy. I have friends that always tell me, they say, I'm gluten intolerant in the United States, but I go to Italy, I eat all the pasta I want. It's not a problem. And it's because of the way that we process the flour here. And but the food is such a major portion of this. So back to my son, he changed his diet. He works out every day now. He's out of the house. He got a haircut. Thank gosh. Finally, he had this long hair and he was
Now
morose.
that's a typical dad
Yeah,
response,
yeah, yeah.
but it's a sign that he is getting clearer.
Yeah, yeah. And it's interesting too, because he was always beating himself up around that he was lazy, or and when he was at school, the schools actually wanted us to test him, but his mother was really worried about him being put on medication. So he went through the IEP process. Very intelligent child. And I was intelligent when I was in school, but I struggled in school. And then I found a couple of teachers, especially a journalism teacher, and then she saw my talents and kind of helped me focus. And then I became a writer and became editor of my high school paper and went into journalism and computers. And, and with the knowledge that he has now that he had this, because he didn't know before I got my diagnosis, plus the changes in the food and the way that we would drink diet sodas. And I cried with him one night when I was figuring all this out. I said, I feel like I've been poisoning you ever since you were a child, and I didn't mean to. Um, but I was looking I would buy healthy food in the stores that said, it was healthy, it was, whatever, but it was processed. It was ultra processed food. So if you read some of these great books on what's really going on, and, it's basically eat real food. It's what it comes down to, right? So I eat a lot of real food now. I do some intermittent fasting that helps as well. But when you think about the food that we're putting into our bodies, this ultra processed food, that's this food that's not food, it's been torn apart and then put back together. It looks like food again, but it's got all of these chemical additives and ingredients. And it's, our brains need nutrition. I always used to think that if I'm slim and I look good, that it's fine, maybe just eat less. But now I find myself eating completely different. There's also some supplements that I highly recommend. There's something called NAC, which is N-acetylene citrate, that I think that's the word. But anyway, NAC, you can buy it at Sprouts, you can buy it at, Vons, I think, or buy it online. And it creates something called glutathione. So NAC works with your liver. It creates this super antioxidant called glutathione. What glutathione does is it goes up in the brain and it mops up excess glutamate in the brain, excess glutamate, and it also helps convert glutamate into GABA. So instead of going and get pharmaceuticals and all these things to kind of shore up your GABA with benzodiazepines or drinking alcohol, you can start eating right, taking supplements, and you'll get your natural GABA levels up.
Wow.
And it's a game changer. It's changed the life of my son. It's changed my life. I can feel the difference. And I look now, I still eat ice cream once in a while and things like that. If I eat bad ice cream, I could literally feel it in my body a couple of days later going, oh, I have a little bit of anxiety, but I gave myself some ice cream the other day. But I've changed all of my eating habits, and especially the snacking habits. And this is where I really feel for the homeless population and the mentally ill and the, socioeconomically challenged, because, they have the word food desert. That's, even here in San Diego, we've got pockets and areas where their primary food purchases are done at an AM PM or a gas station. And so they're eating Pop-Tarts. And if they're neurodiverse and it's inflaming it's inflaming their social skills, it's giving them more anxiety. And all they've got at that point is, I can buy a beer. So I'm eating a Pop-Tart, it's inflaming my neurodiversity. I have this anxiety, I don't want to talk to anybody. And, and I befriended this guy when I was living over in PB. His name was Rick. And I could tell he was sweet, but, I would bring him food or water. He was homeless. And he had he had his stuff, and he was very, he was a systemizer, right? He was clearly on the spectrum. And he would get nervous if I brought him the wrong type of water and things like that. And, the food that he's eating is making it worse for him. but he doesn't have a choice, right? He buys his food out of the gas station. It makes him worse. And then he is kind of beyond help because he doesn't want help. He doesn't even know how far down he's gone. And, and even, oh, and by the way, now that if you can Google this, for schizophrenia, they actually recommend that people take NAC as a supplement to help ameliorate the effects of schizophrenia. There's a doctor in Texas that's giving it to all his patients, and all he does is work with kids with ADHD and autism. And their side effects of NAC is better skin. It's a super antioxidant. If you go to a skin clinic, they'll give you injections of glutathione and pay good money for that, or you can buy, $15 worth of vitamins at the grocery store. Uh,
So, David, many people have their aha moment and they benefit, and that's valuable in itself. I mean, a happier, healthier David is a better friend, a better father, a better everything. But you've taken what you've learned, and it's been less than a year,
right.
and you've created a company that is a nonprofit that is intended to serve this underserved, misunderstood, misdiagnosed, mistreated population. And I'm sure that there are people watching, listening right now who want to know how to connect with you. And what does, and pronounce it again for me, Homo systemus?
Homocystemus.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, and again, this is Simon Baron-Cohen's book, The Pattern Seekers. And there's actually, if you do some of the tests, there's one called the systemizing quotient. And it's the way that we process information is we systemize things, right? And we try and categorize things, and we do predictions and things like that. And I don't want to get into all the details, but I call it Homo systemus. And the reason is I see us as a version of human that includes this broad range of spectrum, right? And I had a friend of mine the other day. He said, "So this is, he says this is a human condition." And I said, "Well, I think this is the human condition. It's the spectrum." And I had another friend of mine who's, he's very, very, very successful in the computer world. And he said, "Well, aren't we all a little bit on the spectrum?" And we kind of are, because it is genetic. It is in the human genome. And there's people in your family that might have it. You might have different versions of it, but also it gets inflamed by environment and food and things like that. So what I decided was, and even coming up with the name, it was just an epiphany that I had when I was reading some things. And I called it Homo systemus because it's almost like it's being able to say we're all humans. We all have this systemizing thing, but it needs to be more, I guess, recognized, understood, and brought out into the sunlight, right? And without the stigmatization of it. So I think that there's a part of me that thinks the name's a little confusing for people, but then it's also like maybe make people think a little bit, right? About the evolutionary aspects of it, because it's all genetic. It's all genetics. Me and my son, we just signed up for a genetics research study, and whenever you work with a doctor or anything like that, they'll start asking you, the people that specialize in all the spectrum issues, they'll start asking you about your family and your family history and all that. So this organization that I put together is really about advocacy right now. It's not like I'm out there looking for donations and things like that. It's really about getting information out about what's going on, current research, current thinking. And then I do go and talk to people that are in addiction treatment centers, which is kind of it's a double-edged sword, because some of the addiction treatment and some of that methodology, they don't really put that into, well, that neurodiversity. Yeah, we've got a lot of kids in here that have ADHD, but it's a separate thing. It's not. It's part and parcel to getting people well, and it's got to be part of the recovery journey. So that's the other thing that I want to advocate for is, screening, first of all. So screening the homeless populations, screening anybody that enters into any type of addiction treatment. These people have to know, and they have to know that maybe some of their issues, social anxiety and things like that, are due to the fact that they have undiagnosed neurodiversity, or many of them are diagnosed, right? So the
What about
statistics,
screening before people get into trouble?
right? Oh, absolutely. And I think I think that is happening now, right? So you have a lot more screening that goes on in children. 20 years ago, it was 1 in 10,000 kids, I think, in California had autism. This past year, diagnosing 1 in 30 children with autism. With ADHD, it's like 1 in 5. So again, you start looking at this, the CDC came out with statistics yesterday about last year, 1 in 16 adults has been diagnosed. That's not including the people that aren't diagnosed. It's 1 in 9, I think, is ADHD children nationally. Again, that's diagnosed. So it's way more, and everybody say, well, it's being overdiagnosed. I think it's being underdiagnosed. I think as we come into better understanding of how to actually treat and manage it, it's not something that you can readily and easily just go, we're going to throw medication at this. And I know that they throw the Adderall medication, some of the other drugs at it, but it's really about food, it's about light, it's about environment, and it's really about compassion and acceptance and understanding that maybe there's just a different way of thinking. That systemizing has led us to the light bulb and the computer and the video that we're watching and our cell phones, and all this technology has come from different ways of thinking, different ways of processing information. Um, so, but yeah, it's the organization that I have right now is really about advocacy and just getting the word out. I do talk with a lot of people that are in addiction treatment that I'm trying to advocate that this is a big part of this. And there's some people that have been in the addiction business for a long time. And, some of them, and one of them specific is a friend of mine. And I'm like, guess what? You're one of us too. And he's been, in the sobriety industry for a quarter of a century. And he's like, oh yeah, I guess so, maybe, And so it's something once they start realizing it. Now, it's not, for a lot of people that are successful, this is not going to be life altering for them. Where I think the opportunity to really ameliorate some unnecessary suffering is in the homeless population, people that are struggling with mental health, these young people that go to 6, 7 times into addiction treatment centers and they keep relapsing, is it breaks my heart because it is unnecessary suffering. And then also the really sad statistic is the amount of suicides. So people with undiagnosed autism, it's like the average age is 39 for death, and most of it is around suicide. I look at guys like me who was suicidal. I was hospitalized and I couldn't figure out why, because on the surface I had everything, but it was all this overwhelm and this miscommunication in my brain and this being hard on myself and all that other stuff. But there's a huge, swath of the population, about, middle-aged white males end up killing themselves or whatever. And they say, well, he was a drinker and everything. And I look back and I've got one friend of mine that I'm thinking of specifically, and her brother-in-law killed himself. And she recognized some things in me, and she said, I'm worried about you. And I knew this lady well, and she said, I'm worried about you because you act like my brother-in-law, and he struggled with alcohol, but then he wasn't drinking, but then he killed himself. And he probably was neurodiverse, and how many of those are avoidable, right? I want to go back to this guy and go back a few years and go and find him and say, listen, I know you struggle with alcohol. I know you want to quit drinking. I know you have depression, anxiety, but maybe you have this. And if you have this, what does that mean? And there's going to be people that, when they figure this out, that aren't going to kill themselves or aren't going to try and kill themselves, that aren't going to be pigeonholed into a mental health diagnosis. Now, I'm not saying that mental health diagnoses aren't real, but there's certain things like with mine and all the diagnoses that I've had.
You've spent your lifetime trying to figure this out.
Yeah. And I had multiple people say, you're this or you're that or whatever. And what they were presentations of me. I call them force fits, or they're constructs, right? So if you have this sensory overwhelm and you're a child and you're in, and I moved around a lot as a kid, I had some childhood trauma. So I had to figure out a way how to mask, and it was people pleasing and approval seeking or things like that built up over time. And those constructs, and the mental health thing, the profession calls them schemas, right? So there's these schemas that I created it's almost like my brain had an immune response to sensory overload. And the immune response was to create these things. But these things were kind of a mismatch, my insides and my outsides. And over time, they show up as mental illness, right? They show up as things like bipolar disorder or manic depression, they used to call it, or general anxiety disorder. But it's amazing, since I've had my diagnosis and all that, I don't feel those things. And now when I was in traffic the other day and I felt this it's called burnout, where it's sensory overwhelm. And traffic's a lot. I've had a long day, I'm busy running around, and I can feel this now. And before, it would have been, I might have thought, because I don't drink alcohol anymore, but I would have thought, well, I'm craving alcohol. I'm not craving alcohol. I'm craving for that anxiety to go away. And then knowing that this is what it is, I drive home, I lay down, I put my noise canceling headphones on. And in my case, I watch a movie that I've watched 100 times or more, but I just put it on in the background low. I don't even watch the movie. It's a movie called Interstellar for some reason, but it calms my nervous system down. And I know that it's going to pass. Whereas before, it would have been, oh, my brain is going, oh, you're a bad person, you're weak, you're this, you're that, you can't go to the gym, you're depressed and all this. When in reality, it was this thing called autistic burnout. And in my case, and in a lot of people's cases, if you get enough autistic burnout, it turns into something called an autistic meltdown. And I would have these meltdowns, and I would have major meltdowns. And, I've had probably 4 or 5 in my life, starting back, I say 2008, but there was probably meltdowns prior to that, and I didn't recognize them as meltdowns. A lot of people that are in the addiction world, they think that they're relapsing, but actuality, they're undiagnosed spectrum, and they're having a meltdown, and they have nothing else but to grab whatever drug it is, even if it's not their drug of choice, because their brain is firing, and they have this overwhelming sense of doom and anxiety and all that, and they're actually in a meltdown. And I think that as more people understand this and give themselves a break, and again, working with my son, it's been transformative for him, right? Where he's had these moments, and he's, and I don't want to out him too much. I think he talks about this a little bit, but he had suicidal ideations that I never knew about, when he was younger, years ago. And so it breaks my heart to think that he had to suffer like that, but he didn't know how to express what was going on. He thought he was lazy or stupid or a bad reader. And it's just, it's so transformative to have this knowledge. So again, back to Homo systemus, and I wrote one little book about it was something about something, because before I figured out that I was, autistic, I figured out that I was doing these things, with these schemas and stuff. This is where I got all the schema language and everything. And they talked about neurodiversity, but I was like, oh yeah, the schema stuff's great and everything. I don't know anything about this neurodiversity, but it's helped me along my way. And so, the other thing about Homo systemus, I am working on a book, really kind of looking at people like me that are older, right? That were missed. I was on a website this past week, and somebody posted like a 10-minute video of somebody like me, and there's like 1,000 comments going, I'm that. These are all people that are 40, 50 years old. I've struggled with alcohol, or I had no idea. And then I got diagnosed, and now what? And all this. But everybody says the same thing pretty much, it's a relief. It's
Yeah.
oh, once you get past the stigma of it, right? It's like, oh, I'm autistic. I've met some people that I won't mention their names. One person that was actually in the Obama administration, and from a technology standpoint, and I met her at a summit. This was maybe 3 months after my diagnosis, and a friend of mine owns a big computer software company, and this is his friend. And I hesitate. He's like, because I dropped out of society basically last year, left the computer industry, left my job, and just put myself into treatment and went into studies and all this to figure all this out. And he's like, where have you been? And I hesitated to tell him. And then I told him, and she said, yeah, me too. And this is a very, very well-known person. And she said, yeah, I struggled for years with all of the things that you're talking about. And, a year and a half ago, a psychiatrist on the East Coast said, have you ever been screened for autism? And she's like, you've got to be kidding me. Why would you screen me for autism? And she said, it's changed her life.
I think you're telling your story here and now will help to change people's lives.
I hope so.
That's the whole goal.
I hope
And
so.
to see a clearly brilliant man who has all the packaging for a successful life to, with vulnerability, share what you've learned about yourself. It's going to help so many people.
I,
Go ahead.
I really hope so, Brenda, because there's so much unnecessary suffering. I mean, in the Buddhist faith, they say there's suffering, which is fine, but the unnecessary suffering part is the part that I went through, and I've had family members went through, and the other part that I talk about with my son is if channeled properly, this is actually a net positive, right? This is actually you've got this brain power that thinks differently. He's a wonderful artist. He's a welder. He's a great writer. He's an artist. And it's just a matter of channeling that energy. One of the traits though that I will say, if you've, whether it's your child or when you were a child and even as an adult, is, and I do this too, is I get hyper focuses, right? It's my brain looking for focus for something. So my son, looking at this expensive telescope that we have here, it was, oh, I got to do astronomy. And then, 2 weeks later, it was like, oh, I'm really into these books or, anime or whatever. It's that intense interest. But it's because of that looking for the focus. But once you can focus it on something, and a lot of kids, will find sports or they'll find academics. And it's interesting when you see the variations. And now that I know what I know and dealing with all the people that I deal with, I can actually recognize it in people. And I don't usually bring it up to them and say, well, have you thought about this? I'd start telling my story. And this is the reason I want to tell my story, is because they start recognizing some traits in themselves. And there's lots of online help that you can get and things like that. But especially the folks that are suffering, it breaks my heart when I go and I talk to, within groups that, especially young kids that are struggling with meth addiction or alcohol, and they're kind of self-medicating, right? And they have been identified as ADHD, but nobody equates the two. And all the brain science and everything now says we have to start looking at this, right? As a society. And that's the hope, and my mission is really about advocacy, education, destigmatization, go back to the, misunderstood, clear up some of the misunderstandings around this, right? It's not one thing. It's not Rain Man. It's lots of things. It's a net positive if you look at it the right way. That's the misunderstood part, the misdiagnosed part. Talking to providers, I still talk to doctors, even my doctor. I went back to my MD, and she was just like, "What are you talking about?" I said, no, here's the paperwork. Here's the diagnosis right here. And with my MD, and nothing against her, but I would see her for 15 minutes each year, right? She's scheduling my colonoscopy or doing my blood test. Oh, your blood tests are all great. Oh, do you still have some anxiety? Do you want some medications or whatever? Nobody sits down and says, were you shy in school?
Oh,
Nobody sits down and has those conversations, or nobody really even says, even with talk therapy, don't tell me about your parents. Tell me what you had to eat all last week, right? That's important. So trying to help with the diagnosis and getting information out there, and more providers are understanding that there's a lot more to this. And then that comes with treatment. Now, the mistreatment part is it's kind of twofold, because a lot of mistreatment, especially with me, I say this, I was bullied when I was young, but it was because of my sensory overwhelm and my differences. A lot of times kids will have difficulty if they've got this sensory overwhelm. They don't make as good eye contact. And we're still animals, right? I have a dog, and if the dog puts their head down, their tail between their legs at the dog park, they tend to get bullied. It's the same thing, unfortunately, with kids. So you end up with somebody that's not making eye contact. It makes them shy, and then they think that I'm a shy person, when really it was more about that sensory overwhelm, and then they grew into the shyness and the social difficulties. So, they're mistreated at one end of that. And then the treatment options for people that are in addiction treatment, and people that keep going back and, going into talk therapy and doing this over and over again. And while they're doing it, it's fine. But then they go out into the world and they have social overwhelm and they have all these issues again. They end up in burnout and meltdowns, and they don't understand that there's an underlying layer. That's what I call it, that underlying layer. I wrote a blog the other day on the website about this hidden layer that I think is going to be better treated once we start understanding it and identifying it. So
And so you've circled back beautifully as we close things out to our jumping off point, which was misunderstood, misdiagnosed, mistreated. And I think that component also of treating yourself with kindness and compassion. So, the closing question, if you could look at our audience and talk directly to them, and someone has heard something that says, "Oh my goodness, this is me," what
yeah.
would you say to that person?
Oh boy, it gives me goosebumps to think about it. It's if you've struggled with alcohol or mental health issues or anxiety issues, or and you start looking at your childhood and were you bullied? Did you have trouble with eye contact? Did you have reading disabilities? Any of those things are all indicators, and there's lots of things on the internet. You can go and do self-tests, but you can finally have there's lots of great books out there. There's lots of great studies, lots of YouTube videos, but be an advocate for yourself, because I didn't have on my journey, I read everything, I read all the studies, and I had to go to a couple of places to say, I want to get screened for autism. And my therapist at the time, who I still talk to, I've had multiple therapists, but he was skeptical. All my other therapists never even mentioned it. And even my friends are like, really? So keep digging. And the other thing, that if you have family members that have had mental health issues, addiction issues, especially your parents, and this is all genetics. You can start looking at your familial relationships and the familial genetics, and you'll start recognizing certain patterns, and you'll start recognizing behaviors. And once you start reading some things about this, your life will change dramatically. Your life will change dramatically, no question about it. Start eating differently. And I would recommend this for everybody, right? Eat differently, because the way that we're eating right now, if we're eating processed foods, it's not helping our brains. And we worry about, our weight and things like that, but you're putting, bad stuff in the gas tank for your brain, and it really affects our brain. So, but the self-advocacy part, and then you even mentioned it, is I can't say this enough, have some self-compassion. You're really doing the best that you could. And if you do have some sort of underlying neurodiversity, don't feel bad about it. Go and get assistance, get help, reach out to me, send me an email. I will talk to anybody. I talk to everybody all the time about this stuff. And in the short amount of time I've been doing this, I've changed a lot of lives, and I've changed a lot of perspective, and have some self-compassion. Have compassion for other people that might have some neurodiversity, right? It affects people differently. And there's people that are like, oh, that guy's a jerk. And it's like, when I realize, and I go back now and I look at some friends, it's like, oh, he was neurodiverse, and he had that confusion and that mismatch, and created some constructs and some schemas just to protect himself in the world. It's all, a lot of this quote unquote mental health challenges we have, it's just our core authentic self trying to protect itself in a sensory overwhelmed world. And we do live in a sensory overwhelmed world. And that's why we're seeing a lot of this more and more being diagnosed for real. And then, but all these mental health challenges coming up. So again, anybody that is listening, if you feel different, if you're going to your yoga studio and you got to park in the same spot, or you get nervous when somebody changes plans or whatever, your nervous system, it's maybe something to consider and to look into. Because the downside is you figure out that you aren't, it's like, oh, I can go about my day. But the upside in actually figuring out that you might have ADHD, OCD, autism, all of these things on this spectrum, and it might be causing you some problems, that's actually a good day.
And when I see you talk about this with such a smile on your face, I hope that that is a similar smile that can come to many members of this audience.
All right.
I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening. I will direct you to David's website. Please do connect with him. And maybe you are a part of an organization or group that would like to engage David to speak on this topic. You can tell we could have gone on for hours
Right,
because he has immersed himself in it. That's the kind of brain he has.
right.
He will immerse himself in the topic and he speaks wisdom and brilliance from science to help set people free. I'm so grateful and honored, David, that you are my
And Brenda, thank you for what you do. I've seen your other videos and the work that you're doing around everything that you do in the fear and all that. And, terrific. Thank you so much for your
Thank
time.
you.
And
Thank
I
you.
appreciate you.
I appreciate you back and thank you for tuning in. I will close the way I do every podcast. Sometimes you're in a dark place, just like that caterpillar in the chrysalis. Keep pressing on. There are answers. Maybe even today you got an answer that you never considered before. As you press against that chrysalis, eventually you'll create strength in your wings so you can fly. And that's all we're rooting for here at the Alchemy of Pain. Thanks for tuning in and have a great day.
God bless, Brenda. Thank you.